This is English 101, week 12, part 6. Um, and this is spring of 2021. So Walker opened up with an example about these people trapped on a boat 200 years ago in the middle of nowhere with very few supplies and very far from land because of a whale attack. Um, then she started talking about the, fear and like what it means and what people usually say about it and what she says about it. And she thinks it actually might be valuable to think about it. So now that she's introduced her idea, she's going to return to that example. So let's see what she's got to say about this. Well, let's return to the year 1819 for a moment, the situation facing the crew of the whale ship Essex. Let's take a look at the fears that their imaginations were generating as they drifted in the middle of the Pacific. 24 hours had now passed since the capsizing of the ship. Capsizing is when the ship sinks, because they're in like a little boat. The big ship is sunk. The time had come for the men to make a plan, but they had very few options. In his fascinating account of the disaster, Nathaniel Philbrick wrote that these men were just about as far from land as it was possible to be anywhere on Earth. The men knew the nearest islands they could reach were the Marquis Islands. I don't know if that's how you pronounce that. Anyway, one of you will know how to pronounce that. 12,000, these islands 12,000 miles away. But they'd heard some frightening rumors. They'd been told that these islands, and several others nearby, were populated by cannibals. Those are human beings who eat other human beings. So the men pictured coming ashore only to be murdered and eaten for dinner. Another possible destination was Hawaii, but given the season, the captain was afraid they'd be struck by severe storms. Now, the last option was the longest and the most difficult, to sail 1,500 miles due south in the hopes of reaching a certain band of winds that could eventually push them toward the coast of South America. But they knew that the sheer length of this journey would stretch their supplies of food and water. To be eaten by cannibals, to be battered by storms, to starve to death before reaching land. These were the fears that danced in the imaginations of these poor men, and as it turned out, the fear they chose to listen to would govern whether they lived or died. It's a very, now remember I tell you guys vivid examples, come up with a vivid example. That's a vivid example. She's got a really, it takes, and you can have your examples can come from history like she does. You can have your example come from a story like I did with the guy in the flood, which was just a story that I heard a preacher tell one time. Actually, I think I heard it on, I think it was a preacher on a TV show. I'm not really very church going. But the point is, she's got a really interesting example. That's the kind of examples that you're looking to make in your papers. It doesn't have to be. You probably don't want something that long in an in-class essay that's only like a couple of pages, because that would eat up most of your word count. But if you're writing, I ask because you guys write short papers for me. Your examples need to be short, but they can be interesting like that. Cool. Okay. So she talks about fear, and she makes the point that what they're scared of determines what they're going to do. And I mean, there's a million. You probably don't need other examples for this, but like on September 11th, for example, when the plane hit the side of the Twin Towers, people in the middle of the building had to decide what to do. Should they go up or down? They didn't know exactly what had happened. So some people went down the stairs because they thought they'd be safe on the ground. But of course, planes were dropping out of the sky. So some people were like, I don't want to go down there because I could get hit by a plane. I'm going to go up to the roof. And of course, we all know what happened, which is that the entire building collapsed and everybody that went to the roof died. And some of the people that went to the bottom lived. But again, it's like, what are you scared of more? Do you know what I mean? Like, are you scared of a plane falling on you and bricks and things falling on you, or in the jet fuel, or are you afraid of getting to the top of the building and the entire building collapses? Right? What you decide to be afraid of might determine the direction you go, and that direction might mean the difference between life and death, as it did for people on September 11th. Some of whom decided to go up they thought they'd be safest on the roof, which I might also have decided. If I was closer to the roof than the ground, if I was like 3/4 of the way up, I might have been like, the roof is closer and probably safe, and then the entire building falls over. Like, that's not what you want. Okay, cool. Well, this is going pretty well. So now she's gonna return to her main point, which is to talk about what she does something interesting here that you guys don't do in your papers, but you could, I guess. But it's a little advanced. But she has an example that she starts off with, and then she talks about her point about fear for a little while, and then she returns to the example to connect it to her point. And then she returns to her discussion about fear for a little while, and then she returns to her example. So she kind of comes back to the example like 3 times. There's a reason for that, by the way, and she'll talk about why in a second. All right, let's take a look at the next paragraph. Now, we might just as easily call these fears by a different name. Instead of calling them fears, what if instead of calling them fears, we call them stories? Because that's really what fear is, if you think about it. It's a kind of unintentional storytelling that we are all born knowing how to do. And fears and storytelling have the same components. They have the same architecture. They're sort of built the same. Like all stories, fears have characters. In our fears, the characters are us. Fears also have plots. They have beginnings and middles and ends. You board the plane takes off, the engine fails. Our fears also tend to contain imagery that can be every bit as vivid as what you might find in the pages of a novel. Picture a cannibal, human teeth sinking into human skin, human flesh roasting over a fire. Fears also have suspense, meaning you want to know what's going to happen next. If I've done my job as a storyteller today, you should be wondering what happened to the men of the whale ship Essex. So that's cute, isn't it? See what she's doing there? She's telling you a story. She starts off her essay with an example about these guys in the boat, but she doesn't tell you what happened to them. And then she talks about her point. And then she returns to the guys in the boat, but she still doesn't tell you what happened to them. See how that keeps you hooked on the essay, because you want to hear her point, because you want to know what happened to those people on the thing. So okay, cool. I just like that she points that out. That it's like a story. You want to know what's going to happen next. Our fears provoke us in very similar forms of suspense. Just like all great stories, our fears focus our attention on a question that is as important in life as it is in literature. What will happen next? In other words, our fears make us think about the future. And human beings, by the way, are the only creatures capable of thinking about the future in this way, of projecting ourselves forward in time. And this mental time travel is just one more thing that fears have in common with storytelling. So when you read a book or you watch a movie, you want to know what's going to happen next. Like especially television's like that, right? You watch a television show and an episode ends with a cliffhanger, and you want to know what's going to happen next. But that's the same thing but when you have fear, you imagine terrible things in your head, just like the terrible, exciting events of a TV show, but they're in your head, but they're happening to you. But notice that the thing that keeps you hooked on a TV show is what's going to happen next. But that's also what fear is doing. Fear is like telling you what's going to happen next. If you get on that plane's going to crash, right? That your fear is making you worried about what if something terrible happens next. Just like a cliffhanger at the end of a TV show episode makes you want to watch the next episode, because you're like, what's going to happen next? And the cliffhanger is always like something's bad, right? So you have your hero and they're starting to win, and then someone shoots them and the episode ends. And you're like, oh no, what happens next? But that's very similar to the way that if you're scared of getting on a plane. Also, I don't really like planes that much. I mean, I'll get on them, but that's planes. My fear is with planes. I'm scared of planes. Now, I still get on planes, but I'm scared the whole time. But I still get on them. That's a situation like that. That's what I'm talking about bravery, right? That you're scared of doing something, but you do it anyway. That's what I do with airplanes. I realize that's very bad to compare to soldiers going into battle, which is a much more intense and real fear, whereas my fear tends to be more irrational, but they have some similarities, even if they're not the same. So it's interesting. She's making a link in the essay between storytelling and fear. And I think the important thing to notice, why is she making this link? The important thing to notice here is that storytelling is that oftentimes we think, don't ever be afraid. Fear is stupid. Ignore your fears. Do the thing. So that we think of fear as being worthless. Get rid of it. But we think of storytelling as being really valuable, right? We like stories. Stories are positive, right? We're interested in stories. Stories are really important to us. The Marvel movies and novels and right, there's all kinds of Shakespeare plays, and those stories matter to us. So the reason she's making this link is because usually you think of fear as something to ignore, but stories is something to pay attention to. Well, if fear and stories are the same thing, she thinks maybe fear is worth paying attention to. All right, so that's heading towards, so that's sort of her point. So okay, let's keep going with this. I'll pick it up in the next video.